Within the confines of American mythology, Andrew Jackson is often purported as the great hero who rose from nothing and became an aristocratic president. He's a rags to riches story that is supposed to be symbolic of American democracy. Anyone can become president. Anyone can rise to power. Anyone can achieve great things. I'm here today to speak out against that narrative. I'm here to show how he was a product of a lot of what was wrong with the United States, both at the time and today. And so when Prager University asks, who was Andrew Jackson? I want to respond. I want to talk about why he doesn't deserve to be commemorated in this day and age, and why I think if we need to find heroes in U.S. history, we can do better. With that said, let's take a look at the video.
Who was Andrew Jackson?
Near the White House overnight, a tense standoff with police as protesters tried to tear down a statue of former President Andrew Jackson.
With ropes tied around his horse, protesters tried to pull down the statue of former US President Andrew Jackson on Monday near the White House, but were ultimately driven back by police. Video showed demonstrators climbing on the bronze statue in Lafayette Square and scrawling "Killer Scum" on its base in the latest bid to destroy images of historical figures considered racist.
Statues of great historical figures like Andrew Jackson are being torn down across America. Here are some facts about Jackson that remind us why his statue should remain. Andrew Jackson became a national hero long before his presidency. In 1815, he won the Battle of New Orleans, the most lopsided victory in U.S. military history. 3 years.
So that is entirely true, for the most part. The thing that's being left out there is that that battle was completely unnecessary to win the War of 1812. So yes, it was a battle in 1815 that was in the War of 1812 to just show how the U.S. tends to name its conflicts isn't always accurate. But the War of 1812 from the U.S. perspective is part of the larger scope of the Napoleonic Wars. And the Napoleonic Wars were over, and Great Britain and the U.S. had arrived at a peace treaty before the Battle of New Orleans had happened. I think there was still some fighting going on in Europe at that time, but certainly between the U.S. and Great Britain, the conflict was over. The treaty just took time to arrive in the United States and news of it to arrive in New Orleans. So when the British attacked Andrew Jackson's troops, it created a very unnecessary conflict. And a big part of why that conflict was so lopsided had more to do with British incompetence, if you look at the details, than Andrew Jackson's great success. So, while, yes, he did technically do what they're saying, one could argue that he did it in a useless position, and it wasn't even his greatness that was the reason why that conflict went well. Though, he became popular because of it.
Years later, he boldly invaded Spanish territory in Florida, seizing 2 major forts, and took charge as military governor. This set up the U.S. acquisition of Florida in 1819.
So the context of that is, after the Napoleonic Wars ended, Spain had a very difficult time managing its colonies. And so Spanish Florida was kind of not governed by its European colonial masters. So the Seminole people in the North had a practice where they were taking in blacks that were freed and former slaves that would come into the panhandle of Florida. And people in Georgia, right after the War of 1812, got very angry at this practice and sent in militias to start fighting against the Seminole people. And the Black Seminoles, as they would be historically known as, who joined the Seminole Nation. So you end up with this conflict where you have Georgia militias constantly crossing into northern Florida, the Seminole people fighting back, and Spain doing nothing about it. Finally, the Seminole, after enough invasions, get fed up and decide to raid back, and by doing so, provoke the wrath of the United States government. The U.S. government eventually sends Andrew Jackson in, who not only crosses into Florida to deal with the Seminole, crossing Spanish territory, but then proceeds to, after destroying village after village, go in and take over 2 Spanish towns. This does force the hands of Spain to concede Florida to the U.S. because they can't manage their resources, and there's nobody else to take Florida off their hands but the United States. And so the U.S. does purchase it, and it's a whole thing, and Florida becomes part of the United States. The problem with this narrative of praising Jackson for this is that he is a representative of slaveholding interests and destroys entire Native American villages as a response to his call to action as a U.S. general. And one could argue that maybe he wasn't in the position to deny orders or whatever, but he opted to choose the tactic of destroying and doing as much damage as he did. So he does not get to be absolved from responsibility in this at all. He caused a great deal of harm to a great many people, and also, because of his actions, cut off one of the only routes from Georgia that slaves could take to easily get away from slave masters. He was part of the slaveholding class himself, as I'll show a little bit more later. And so he had a vested interest in defending these institutions and did not care about the lives of Native Americans. With that said, let's continue.
Jackson's popularity greatly expanded participation in U.S. elections. The last campaign before he became a candidate drew a total of 108,000 voters. 12 years later, in 1832, 1,300,000 voted in his landslide re-election campaign, an increase of 1,200%. Jackson.
So there's 2 things that are problematic with that particular narrative. One is that Jackson had very little to do with that rise. And 2 is that there's a large scope of years going on between those 2 dates. You have 1820 and 1832. And within that span of time, universal white male suffrage becomes a thing within the United States. A lot of states over the period of time had given up the idea that just land holdings or taxes should be the basis for voting. So all white men, I think with the exception of maybe in Louisiana, and I mean the actual state of Louisiana, not the full territory, were allowed to vote. I think they didn't eliminate it completely until like 1840 or something like that. The point being is that universal white male suffrage became a thing during that time. So yes, Andrew Jackson was a relatively popular figure. Yes, he did have a lot of people come out and vote for him, but he did not actively expand democracy. He just happened to be there at the moment that democracy expanded. So I don't know how much we should really give credit for that kind of thing to him.
Jackson's toughness averted the breakup of the Union and sectional conflict 30 years before the Civil War, when he unequivocally threatened force against South Carolina, which had tried to nullify federal tariffs.
So the nullification of the tariffs, basically in summary, is that there was a tariff that was imposed by the federal government that was disadvantageous to the South. The South was not happy with this. South Carolina said, well, if we have a law that completely violates the interest of our state, we can nullify it. In response, Jackson first changed the tariff and made it more of like an appeasement for the South to give them slightly more favorable terms for their particular interests at the time. The details really aren't that important, but basically there was already the start of the divide between manufacturer north and agrarian slave plantation south. So he negotiated with them. But in order to stomp his place in history, he did enable an act called the Force Act, which basically stated that he had the right to send in military force to collect tariffs if Southerners refused to hand them over. Did this stop the Civil War from starting? Probably not, from a historical perspective. Like, it didn't delay it any more than it would have. I think the appeasement did a lot more to stop the radicalization of people from South Carolina than the force did. If anything, I think the force might have actually increased some tensions over time and made the South feel as though that its policies were not being represented in government and that it might be best to remove itself from the rest of the nation. And so South Carolina ends up being one of the first states to secede from the Union in 1860. So did Jackson do anything there? It's hard to tell because we can't really look at an alternative history. But I'm going to give them this one. I mean, he did end up, at the very least, stopping a state from attempting a policy that could lead to secession.
In 1835, President Jackson kept a far-fetched campaign promise. He paid off the national debt, all of it, for the only time in U.S. history. Although he was known...
So, yes, Andrew Jackson did manage to pay off the national debt. First of all, the reason he did this was because he was very fearful of banks and he was fearful of debt because of some really bad experiences when he was younger. He ended up in some really bad land deals that caused him to end up in huge amounts of debt and caused a lot of problems for him. So he abolished the bank, the National Bank, and he decided to pay off the national debt. So how did he do this? Where did he get the money from? He sold off Native American land that the federal government claimed it owned, and he sold it to homesteaders as they were moving out west. And he created a real estate bubble that, when it burst, not only increased debt to such a great extent that it ended up leading to it eventually surpassing what the debt was originally over time. We never looked back from that debt. We have not been able to pay down that debt since. And it led to a 6-year depression. So, yeah, he technically paid off the debt, but any conservative figure from today would probably be confused at why we're praising somebody for selling federal lands and for dealing in such socialistic programs towards people who were attempting to move out west because they were getting decent deals, any white settlers moving out west. But I'm sure there would be a huge, a huge factor of ignorance towards the plight of Native Americans who suddenly find white settlers on their land. Basically, he didn't do anything good. He messed up the economy over time. He failed. He failed in his job. Yes, he cleared the debt, but at what cost? It was for a year. And it caused a lot more problems and a lot more harm.
Known as an Indian fighter, Jackson also adopted an orphaned native 3-year-old he rescued from the battlefield. He raised Lincoln Jackson alongside his other adopted son, Andrew Jackson Jr., and hoped to enroll him in West Point, but the Indian boy died at 17 of tuberculosis.
So, when it comes to Jackson's son, this is a very complicated factor in his story. A lot of people would like to pretend that Lincoln's status as someone that Jackson saw as valuable to save his life as a 3-year-old redeems him. It makes him a hero, that maybe his views were a little bit more complicated. The problem is that there's no evidence to show that he was treated well, and there's every bit of understanding to say that he was kind of treated poorly. The National Park Service has a thing on their website about Lincoln Jackson, where it flat out states, Lincoln's status in the Jackson household remains murky. Like many young Creeks taken as captives by white army officers, he was intended to be a pet or childhood companion for a young family member. The legal status of these dependent children is unknown, but appears to have been distinct from chattel slavery known by African Americans of the plantation households the boys joined. So when you take that into account, he was not the only one to take the Creek children. And there's an argument for the fact that it wasn't this benevolent thing, but was actually more of a representation of wanting to gawk at the child over time. And there's probably a mix of love and paternalistic understanding as you steal a child from their culture and identity and remove them and try to make them part of your white society. And I think understanding Jackson in his larger context, we can see that his adoption of Lincoya is probably more representative of his position towards indigenous peoples in general. He tended to have a policy of wanting to civilize, and I hate that word so much, to civilize, which is codified as which is a nice and codified way of saying remove the culture and cause genocide towards the Native Americans. He wanted to make them as European and white as possible over time. So an example of this is actually found in his first annual message to Congress, which would have been in December of 1829, where he says the condition and ulterior destiny of the Indian tribes within the limits of some of our states have become objects of much interest and importance. It has long been the policy of government to introduce among them the arts of civilization, in the hope of gradually reclaiming them from a wandering life. This policy has, however, been coupled with another wholly incompatible with its success. Professing a desire to civilize and settle them, we have at the same time lost no opportunity to purchase their lands and thrust them farther into the wilderness. By this means, they have not only been kept in a wandering state, but been led to look upon us as unjust and indifferent to their fate. Thus, though lavish in its expenditures upon the subject, government has constantly defeated its own policy, and the Indians in general, receding farther and farther to the west, have retained their savage habits. A portion, however, of the southern tribes have mingled much with the whites, and made some progress in the arts of civilized life, have lately attempted to erect an independent government within the limits of Georgia and Alabama. These states, claiming to be the only sovereigns within their territories, extended their laws over the Indians, which induced the latter to call upon the United States for protection. So his policy generally was one that followed a lot of what George Washington had established towards Native Americans, so I can't put all of the blame on Jackson in this regard, but that doesn't mean that he changed that policy. He didn't move forward with it. As he summarizes here, one of the issues going on with the indigenous peoples of the South is that they claim sovereignty over certain territories. And while the fighting and the jurisdiction between the Supreme Court in Jackson and the indigenous tribes tribes and nations, I should say, ends up being one of general conflict and trying to figure out who gets to govern who, the end result of all of that fighting is that Andrew Jackson ends up deciding to take the side of states who claim they own the territories. The federal government doesn't own it, the indigenous peoples don't own it, it is the states that have a right to it. And the states have a vested interest in expanding their personal populations, their white populations, to the detriment of the native peoples. And Jackson takes their side. In the following year, in his second annual message to Congress, he ends up stating, "It will relieve the whole state of Mississippi and the western part of Alabama of Indian occupancy." And this is referring to the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which ends up leading to the Trail of Tears. "And enable those states to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power." So again, who's population is rapidly growing and gaining wealth and power. It's not the indigenous peoples, it's the white people generally living in the state. And who else has power at that point? Universal white male suffrage was just a thing. It's not going to be people of color. It's not going to be women. It's going to be white men. When we speak about white men historically having power, this is what we're talking about. This is exactly it. It'll separate the Indians from immediate contact with settlements of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions. Will retard the progress of decay, which is lessening their numbers, and perhaps cause them to gradually to cast off their savage habits and become interesting, civilized, and Christian community. A civilized Christian community. That was his goal for the indigenous peoples. Now, he then goes on to say, what good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion? So one of the arguments in favor of Jackson is that he was part of the zeitgeist of his time, that he was a representative of the people and the needs of white people in the United States. But I want to bring up another quote from Edward Everett from Boston, who flat out said, "The evil, sir, is enormous. The inevitable suffering is incalculable. Do not stain the fair fame of the country. Nations of dependent Indians, against their will, under color of law, are driven from their homes into the wilderness. You cannot explain it. You cannot reason it away. Our friends will view this measure with sorrow, and our enemies alone with joy. And we ourselves, sir, when the interest and passions of the day are past, shall look back upon it, I fear, with self-reproach and regret, as bitter as unveiling." Not every one of his contemporaries was in favor of the Indian Removal Act. He doesn't get to dictate that. There were plenty of people, including a member of his own unit back in the day during the War of 1812, Davy Crockett, who spoke out against his positions about removing Native American populations. Jackson had an agenda. He wanted to protect the states that he wanted to protect, and he did not care who had to be removed in order to protect the positions of Georgia and Alabama. He did not care about removing the Native Americans, and he justified it in his own way of saying, well, if they want to protect their culture and they want to protect their identity, they can go take it somewhere else. He performed a forced removal. And the Indian Removal Act, while it was generally conceived to allow the Native groups to create treaties for their movement, to create something beneficial and mutual between the federal government and the Native American populations, Jackson used force in more cases than not. The Seminoles responded negatively in particular, and the Second Seminole War was fought because of the attempts at forced removals. People were removed in chains and marched 5,000 miles from the south all the way to Oklahoma. There was some form of a Trail of Tears in the north as well, which is much less well documented. And so it was across the country, but the primary part of it was in the south, and specifically targeted the Seminoles, the Creek, and the Choctaws. It speaks volumes that Jackson took these groups of people and shipped them off. And if you want a small glimpse of the brutality that we're talking about, I have another quote here, which is sectioned off from an account of a traveler who signed himself a native of Maine from the New York Observer in January of 1839. "On Tuesday evening, we fell into a detachment of the poor Cherokee Indians. About 1100, we found them in the forest camped for the night. Under a severe fall of rain, Many of the aged Indians were suffering extremely from the fatigue of the journey and ill health. We found the road literally filled with a procession of nearly 3 miles in length. The sick and feeble were carried in wagons. Multitudes go on foot. Even aged females, apparently nearly ready to drop in the grave, were traveling with heavy burdens. On the sometimes frozen ground, with no covering for feet, they buried 14 or 15 at every stopping place. Some carry a downcast, dejected look of despair. Others, wild, frantic appearance as if to pounce like a tiger upon their enemies. The point is that they were angry. They were hurt. They were dejected. And Jackson kind of gave off this paternalistic, I know better perspective as he ripped Native American populations from their ancestral lands and brought them into a new territory, promising them better life. The problem is none of the protections of food and resources ever really made it to a lot of the groups when they traveled across the Trail of Tears. None of the semblance of this being a free decision between two parties was ever really upkept. Military force was imposed. And again, Jackson wanted to remove these populations for the benefit of the states. There's no justifying this particular position. There's no making it better. He did what he did. And to pretend otherwise, and to ignore this in the Prager University video, is, I think, perhaps the greatest lie that I think they're telling. It's a lie by omission in this particular case. I'm pretty sure that that's the end of the video, but let me take a look. Yeah. And Thomas Jefferson's another one I should deal with soon. To further my point also about him as a leader, this is an ad that he took out in 1804. And this ad basically asks that his slave be returned to him in October of 1804. And he charged, he was going to reward $50, which was quite a sum at that time. And he offered, quote, $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him to the amount of 300. This was not a person who supported the rights of people of color. This is not a person who was a hero. He was the hero of a very specific brand of democracy, namely that of white male suffrage. Over the course of Jackson's lifetime, he owned 150 slaves. He bought and sold human beings. By this point of his own sword and the barrels of the guns of his soldiers, he was responsible for countless deaths as General of the United States Army. As president, he enabled genocidal policies that led to thousands of deaths, countless suffering, and the removal of entire peoples from their ancestral lands in the Trail of Tears. Those who stayed behind to try to hold on to their ancestral lands were met with bigotry, racism, and the encroachment of white settlers. This is the legacy of Jackson. This is who he was and what he represented. These are what his actions speak to. Prager University can pretend to ignore the Trail of Tears and not pay any lip service to it in their video, which I find to be a form of lying by omission in this case. But people like Donald Trump, when they purport patriotic education, institutions like Prager University, when they appeal to American mythology, when they appeal to the notion of a whitewashed history, where Andrew Jackson is the hero of democracy, when he is the rags to riches story of someone who comes from nothing and can become the President of the United States, they are doing a disservice to Americans, to the honesty and truth that Jackson is not a hero. He does not deserve statues. He does not deserve to be on the $20 bill. Even in his own time, his atrocities were recognized as things that would go down in history. we can do better than recognizing Jackson in this whitewashed way. So when these institutions speak out and say, this is who Jackson is, I have to say that this is not the hero that I want to see as a representative of the US, because of all the reasons I outlined, and so much more. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the bell for notifications, and feel free to follow me on the Twitter listed in the description below, and check out my new Discord listed there. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.